Hi guys, Dr. Stephen Samuel here. So I'd like to talk today about autism and autistic traits and how they relate to TTRPGs. So traditionally, autism has been associated with reduced pretend play in childhood, and it's also been associated with difficulties with social interactions. Two things which are really important in TTRPGs. So you might expect that autistic people don't particularly gravitate towards TTRPGs. Wrong. So first of all, the estimated global incidence of autism, everyone in the world, is around 1%. So a recent study found that 4.7% of tabletop board gamers were autistic, reported being autistic, but it could be higher than 6% depending on how you count the results of something called the autism-spectrum quotient. Now, the autism spectrum quotient was created in order to measure autistic traits in the general population, and it comes with a recommendation of a sort of cutoff point of 32. If you score higher than 32 points out of 50, it doesn't mean that you're autistic. It just means that there's a possibility of that, because in the original study, 80% of those participants who did score 32 or higher actually had a diagnosis. So I wanted to know the level of autistic traits in tabletop role-playing gamers, and I also wanted to know what it was associated with. Was it associated with liking social interaction in the game, which is something that would be surprising given what we think we know about autism? And would it be associated with things like enjoying role-playing, which again would be surprising given what we think we know about autism? There are some caveats to put in here straight away. So in recent years, there's been the emergence of something called the double empathy problem, which is that autistic people's understanding of other minds has traditionally been measured by how well they understand the neurotypical person's mind. But if we ask people how well they understand another autistic person's mind, they do better than a neurotypical person might do. Why is that important? Because this just there's no impairment in the brain. There's just difficulty understanding different people from themselves rather than people who share their neurotype. I bring this up because the traditional idea that there's some sort of impairment in understanding other people's minds might be much more limited than was previously thought. Anyway, let's leave that to a side for a moment. Back to tabletop role-playing games. So I collected data from 319 very experienced TTRPG gamers. I gave them the autism spectrum quotient to measure their autistic traits. Remember, this is designed for the general population, so it's not a diagnostic tool, but it gives you an idea, it gives you a scale. I also asked them what it was they enjoyed or prioritized about TTRPGs and what they didn't. So then all that was needed was to correlate the results of the autism spectrum quotient with the ranking that people gave to each of these things. So what did we find? So there were three associations. First, greater autistic traits were associated with greater importance attached to problem solving. They were also positively associated with importance attached to accurate simulation. They were negatively correlated with socializing. What I mean by that is the higher autistic traits were, the lower the priority was for socializing in TTRPGs. What do these results suggest? So first of all, role-playing, which is the part most related to pretending, which supposedly is difficult in autistic people, had no relationship with autistic traits. Secondly, the hypothesis that people high in autistic traits might deprioritize social interaction in TTRPGs, that was borne out. Now, it doesn't mean that players high in autistic traits wish the game was non-social, because there are plenty of other formats of RPGs other than tabletop which they could play instead. So they're clearly getting something out of this. We know that people higher in autistic traits really seem to enjoy or prioritize the problem-solving aspect and also the simulation aspect. This chimes quite neatly with the idea of the autistic brain as one which is more systematic and systemizing and enjoys organizing things, and maybe is quite literal. That's also weird in the context of TTRPGs, because TTRPGs are pretend, they're not literal. But maybe the simulation aspect of that is something that scratches the literal back, so to speak. And is probably the most surprising finding of this study. So in that recent study I told you about of tabletop board gamers, 4.7% of players reported being autistic, 6.7% scored 32 or higher on the autism spectrum quotient. So what was the proportion of tabletop role-playing gamers in this study who scored 32 or higher on the autism spectrum quotient? It was 11.9%, much higher than tabletop board gamers. A lot higher than the global average. Whether because people higher on traits are getting so much out of the problem solving and the simulation aspect, it's difficult to say. For autistic people, it might be really handy to have the turn-taking structure in a tabletop role-playing game where everyone knows when they are speaking. Lots of social interactions are quite highly scripted and stereotyped, which might be quite comforting for someone who is maybe more concerned about the complete open-endedness of typical human interaction. But what is really clear here is that autistic players and players high on autistic traits are here to stay when it comes to TTRPGs. They enjoy them, and they don't have to. They can do something else. They can stay online. They can use a screen, but they enjoy being with other people playing the game. I have no idea how many of these people who responded to this survey play in mixed neurotype groups. So how many of them play with neurotypical people, and how many of them maybe play in neurodivergent only groups. My guess is more the former than the latter. Overall, the idea that autistic people and people high in autistic traits don't necessarily want to hang around people very much, that is not borne out by these results. TTRPG seems to have some ingredient that brings them to the table.